Well, hello and an extremely warm welcome to my channel. My name's Louise Savage of Louise Savage Muses. A warm welcome if you are a returning viewer, and an equally warm welcome if you are viewing my channel for the very first time. So I realised with absolute horror, but maybe not total surprise, that I haven't done a reading wrap up since January. And so I'm going to do that today. It now being the 2nd of May as I make this recording. I think it's the 2nd. And I have got quite a stack of book on my knees here, but I'm not going to wrap up on every book that I've read since then, because since then I've read the entire Women's Prize for Non-Fiction long list. I'm making my way through the fiction shortlist. I don't think there's anything else I've left out and not reported on, or I'm not going to report on. So this is my reading that I've done prior to that, subsequent to that, and in between. So there's quite a mix here. And some of the books have featured as my books of the month. But I don't mind, I'm happy to talk about those books again. In fact, I'm delighted to do that. And also I know that, there are far more people who will be watching this wrap up than maybe who tune into my book of the month. So forgive me if you feel there's a little bit of overlap here for some of you. But the first book that I am going to talk about is this one, and it's Kitchen by Banana Yoshimoto. I wanted to get that right. And I know there's a lot of love for this book, and I feel like I'm really late to the party, because when was it actually written? Ages and ages ago. Was it even the 90s? I'm just trying to see. I think it says, I haven't got my glasses on, but I think, yeah, it says 1988. I can't believe that this book is that old, because it just feels so fresh and certainly at the moment incredibly relevant. So I read this book as one of the Savage prompts, because one of the prompts, I can't remember whether it was January or February now, might even have been March, dare I say, I think it was February, was to read a book with a kitchen utensil in the title, or no, on the cover. So you can see that there are lots and lots of kitchen utensils on this cover, and obviously, the title's a bit of giveaway in that department. And I almost feel like I only read this, maybe 2 months ago, but I almost feel like I'm ready to sit down and read it again, because this is an incredibly poignant, absolutely stunningly beautiful written series. It's 2 novellas in here. And I'm going to talk about the first one. In which a young girl, she's been orphaned, she's been brought up by her grandmother, and her grandmother has just died. And one of the things that she has in her life is her love of cooking. She's absolutely passionate about cooking, hence the title. And when her grandmother dies, she's still living in the home that they lived in together, but she knows that she can't stay there very long. I said young girl, but actually she's a young woman. And she is invited to go and stay with a mother and son who she doesn't know, but who the mother knew her grandmother really well. And this huge act of generosity from this mother and son to absorb this young girl into their family. And there's a kind of love interest that develops. I don't want to say too much, because it's such a beautifully told story. I would love to think that you're going to rush off and read it. But one of the wonderful things about this is that it tackles, well, it doesn't tackle, actually, that's not fair. The mother is transgender, and what I love about this, it's a book, it's a Japanese author. So obviously it's set in Japan, all the characters are Japanese. I say obviously, I don't know why that has to be obvious. And it's just accepted almost without question that that's who this mother is. And I loved that. I loved the way that this transgender character is portrayed as being such a generous, thoughtful. She's got incredible sort of social conscience, and she takes this young girl under her wing. And I just really wish that society would, I'm going to be really controversial and say, grow up a bit and stop worrying about this concept and accept people, you know, no matter how they identify, you know, in terms of their gender. It doesn't, it's just, to me personally, and I'm going to say this, it's an irrelevance. You know, we should all just be able to, it's none of our business. Anyway, I'm preaching, and, you know, feel free to respond to what I'm saying if you feel the need to, but that's just my strong sort of personal beliefs about this. And so this book was, for me, really refreshing and beautiful in the way that it dealt with that issue. There we are. And then next up, no, that's the wrong one. Doing well today. I read The Gap in Time by Jeanette Winterson. Now, this book came out, whatever year it was, a good few years ago now, when it was the 400th anniversary. I can't remember, I think of Shakespeare's death, but possibly of his birth. I should have looked it up. At least I know that it's 400 years, I suppose. And so various authors were commissioned to write reinterpretations or new versions of, not new versions, they were invited to take a Shakespeare play and to use that play as inspiration for producing a new novel. I think in most cases it was a novel. And I've read a few of these. I read I think it's Joe Nesbo's interpretation of Macbeth, which I didn't particularly rate very highly. Actually, I was quite disappointed. It's the only book of theirs that I've read, and it didn't gel with me. But I also have read Tracy Chevalier's version of Othello, which is called New Boy, and I thought that was fantastic. Anyway, this is Jeanette Winterson's version of A Winter's Tale. Now, A Winter's Tale is one of those Shakespeare plays that has the most complicated plot. So and so's married to so and so. A baby gets switched. And I find those plots really difficult to hold in my head. They make a lot of sense when you're watching them on the stage, but keeping track of the characters when you're reading them on the page, I think, is really tricky. But of course, that's not what the play was intended to be anyway. And so I wasn't sure how I was going to get on with this book. And A Winter's Tale is not one of his plays that I know particularly well. I don't really know it. But Jeanette Winterson is such an intelligent writer, and I think she's probably worked with this play for decades, and it's just genius. It's kind of a romp in a way. She's set the play in sort of what seems to be fairly contemporary-ish London, and we also kind of dot over to America at points. Because Shakespeare often takes us here, there and everywhere in his plays. And the key character in the original play is called King Leontes, but she makes him Leo, and he's a hedge fund manager. So you've got this incredibly wealthy man with a wife who he indulges, who he adores, but actually doesn't trust. And the novel opens with him leaving this baby in a baby hatch, or is it the other character, and it's a while since I've read it, picking up a baby from a baby hatch. But basically there's this whole baby swap thing that goes on, and all this mixture about identity, mix up with different people's identities. So the plot is pacey and you know, interesting. The dialogue is really sort of wisecracky and pungent. And what I absolutely adored about this book, and I really probably ought to go back and look at the play, is that for me this is a novel very much about forgiveness. She really she writes a little essay at the end where she kind of brings this up as well. You know, she's really showing the importance of that and the generosity of that particular abstract idea, I think. And it's called The Gap in Time because there is kind of like a time shift that goes on within the novel. So yeah, I thought this was going to be quite a light, slight read, and in some ways it is, but it's very entertaining, and actually it did end up really making me think. There's a sort of profundity to this that perhaps I wasn't expecting. And then I read The Marvelous Cesaly, which I know I picked as my book of the month. I think I did anyway, yeah, earlier in the year. And this is written by Annie Garthwaite, beautiful cover. And it opens with the young Cecily Neville watching the burning of Joan of Arc. So right from the beginning, especially if you're into historical fiction or you're into history, you've got that very sort of visceral, very famous moment in history to kind of centre yourself as a reader. And what I love about this book is that it covers the Wars of the Roses. It spans 30 years, not the entire Wars of the Roses because they went on and on and on, but 30 years of that through the life of Cecily Neville, who was a really, really powerful woman. She was married to Richard of York, who was ostensibly, I suppose in many ways, the heir apparent, even though technically not. And the King, Henry IV, who's on the throne, has a lot of weaknesses, and Richard, Duke of York, very often is having to step in and stabilise the country because of that. And she is there behind him, plotting, making him stronger, and also bringing up this series of children, one of whom who will become king. So I loved the way that Annie Garthwaite makes it really clear that women in Elizabethan society, where did that come from? Women in the 1400s in England could be really powerful if they you know, if they were crafty enough and determined enough. And the other thing about Cecily is she's not always totally likeable. I like that. She's a kind of warts and all character. She's very ruthless, but equally she absolutely adores her children. Her approach to motherhood sometimes seems very distanced and remote, but it's kind of because she's forced into that situation because of the time in which she lives. So I just love this, and I now think I understand the Wars of the Roses a little bit better because this is history at its best, isn't it? You're sort of absorbing, inhaling the historical context without realising that's what you're doing as you read a novel like this, and it's absolutely brilliantly written. I'm desperate to read the sequel, but I just haven't had time yet. Haven't got hold of a copy yet. I need to do that. And while all of that was going on, I was reading The Heeding by Rob Cowen, and beautifully illustrated by Nick Hayes. So this is a volume of poetry, and it's set during lockdown. So this, well, when I say set, he was writing this during lockdown, and you've got all these fantastic illustrations by Nick Hayes throughout the book. I'm just trying to see, some of them are really powerful. Yeah, here's one of a beacon. Yeah, just absolutely loved this, and I found this really, really moving. One of the things that Rob Cowen kind of focuses on in here is how lockdown made you reassess your relationship with nature, and also, you know, your attitude to some of the sort of daily routines and your relationships, and he does it beautifully. So I'm going to read you, just to give you a flavour, I'm going to read you this poem, Noises Off, I'm going to try and do it without my glasses. I might have to reach for them in a minute. Noises off. Indigo sky pressing down like debt. All cars quietened. Nothing stirs. Late spring stasis. Abandoned. Wrecked. Hell of a thing to be afraid of air. Of touch. Of family. Of friends. Of work. To not leave home for 4 days straight. Through the wall I hear a hacking cough, a baby crying, unchecked frustrations. A barking dog is marking time for the passing choirs of demented sirens. I stand in our yard as evening falls, first time outside all day, eyes closed. A blackbird is fluting, the season's off the hook, a show no one's attending. The dog begins again, wound up. This deathly town so disconcerting, nothing into nothing, only darkness noiselessly arriving over the long, low exhale of land, the seethe and tick of insects stirring. And I know that's a little bit sort of depressing and negative, but it immediately takes me back to that time. It's almost like, lockdown seems a long time ago. It's almost like a different life. And that's probably one of the more negative of the poems in this collection, because a lot of them are, as I said, are bringing out the whole sort of way your relationship changed with nature and with time and the world around you. But I love that poem for being able to send me straight back to how I was feeling at the time. Yeah, lovely, really, really clever collection of work. And that's the first time I'd read anything by him. And then I read Nadine Gordimer's The House Gun. And again, I've talked about this before in another video. So you might want to fast forward if you've heard all that. But this Nadine Gordimer was a South African writer. She was writing in the, I want to say the 60s, 70s, but I think this novel was written in the 90s, if I remember correctly. And I'd never read anything by her, and she won the Nobel Prize for Literature, so I've been really intrigued by her writing for a long time. And she was a novelist who I'd seen on bookshelves growing up in various houses of friends whose parents were teachers or lecturers or whatever. So I kind of felt that there might be something really meaningful in her writing, and I thought this book was really powerful. It's the story of a married couple in South Africa, white South African. Their son is arrested. He's in his 20s. He's arrested for murder. They are completely taken by surprise. They have no idea that he's capable of doing anything like this. And their lives just spiral out of control. And it's about how they try to make sense of this information, and the effect it has on their relationship. And you also then have the whole sort of court case. We are learning things almost kind of, it feels, in real time. And I found this, it's a very, she's really interested in the psychology of the marriage, I think. But also that whole thing about how can you ever know your children, what are your children actually capable of if given the right or wrong set of circumstances. And it does look at race as well, because the barrister who defends their son is a black South African, and of course it's not long after the end of apartheid, so it's a very kind of nuanced moment in South African history. So yeah, I found this book really, really readable and fascinating. So next up is The Girl on the Train by Paula Hawkins. Now, I read this in preparation for an interview that Simon Savage, my son, and I did with Paula Hawkins a week or so ago. And I had read this 10 years ago when it first came out. And I wasn't sure how it would feel rereading it, because it's a thriller, and of course I knew what happened. But equally, you know, I forget so much. And oh my goodness, I just gobbled this up for the second time, because it's an act of genius in that she sets the, so basically an awful lot of the novel centres around the daily commute from outer London into the centre. And the main character, whose name ridiculously Rachel, that's it, I just temporarily forgot. Rachel is commuting daily in and out of London, and she is an incredibly, we see she narrates some of the novel, and then two other women also narrate, and she is completely unreliable because she's an alcoholic. So her narration, she has blackouts, she can't remember things, and also she is to a certain degree a fantasist. So there's one particular stretch of the line where there are a series of houses, and she sees there are two houses in particular that she's interested in, and in one of them there's a couple, and she's fabricated their names. She's made up this life that isn't actually their life, but bizarrely they become the focus of the story, because a woman disappears. So you've got, you're being tugged in all these different directions. It's really pacey. I'd forgotten how much I love thrillers. And the twists are brilliant. There are moments where your breath's taken away because, your perception is completely shifted. And again, because you've got these different women coming in and narrating, and each of the narrators, not just Rachel, are equally unreliable for whatever reason. I can't say too much more because I'm worried I'll give away spoilers. But yeah, I think again, the summer holidays are approaching over here in the UK, or the Whit half term. And this is if you haven't read this book, it's just a great, I think a brilliant holiday read. I would recommend it for that sort of purpose, or to get you out of a reading slump maybe. And the other book that we read for the interview was The Blue Hour, and I think that Paula Hawkins is really, really developing and maturing. Sounds patronising as a writer, but I think she's finding her voice more and more, and I absolutely adored this. So it's the story of an artist. This is an artist that Paula has invented, and alongside this artist's whole body of work, which includes sculpture, ceramics, oil paintings, watercolours, you name it. Anyway, the artist has died, and her legacy is being curated in a big sort of stately home / gallery, on the borders between Scotland and England. And the curator becomes one of the leading characters in the novel. He's obsessed with this woman's art and her story, and has been since he was very young. So he's really interesting and a very likable character. Often in thrillers there are, there's because we see most of the story really through his eyes, and as I say, he's eminently likable, I think. But anyway, the novel opens with this fantastic sort of concept that the artist has produced a piece of work which is currently being exhibited in the Tate Modern, and it's a sculpture, and it contains a bone which everybody has assumed would be the bone of a deer, but actually it turns out that it might be a human bone. Now, what do you do in that situation? You can't really display a human bone in an art gallery when you don't know the provenance of that bone. And the other thing that complicates things is that the artist built the glass case. She designed and made it that goes over the sculpture, and it's actually part of the artwork itself. So do you destroy it? What do you do? So there's this big conundrum, and it's all kind of, the thriller element comes in because this artist, she lived on an island off Scotland, which, well, I say island, it's a tidal island. It's only an island at certain hours of the day. So you can get a car across when the tide is out, but most of the day it's cut off, it's isolated. So you've got this really sort of creepy setting on Ellis Island. And her husband, who she had a very, very sort of up and down relationship, shall we say, disappeared some years, well, many years prior to the beginning of the novel. So, you know, there's this, but there's a human bone in there, and da 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 da. So you've got these thriller elements. And of course, the curator's drawn into it because he's got to manage the publicity potentially around this this artwork. And I love this. I think that this book, if you're interested in art particularly, it looks at the issue of curatorship, of legacy, you know, who actually should be responsible for artworks of an artist after they've died, who should be responsible for showcasing their work, and also looking at the value of art, because of course, you know, if there's a lot of noise around this artist, then potentially her works become more valuable. And I really love that. I think as a sort of investigation of what art actually means in contemporary society, I think it's very interesting. Yeah, I couldn't put it down. And then I read Murder at Gull's Nest. Again, I was lucky enough to interview Jess Kidd last week. She is a joy. I've loved all of her books. If you haven't read Himself, her second novel, you really should. It's one of my favourite books of all time. And the thing I love about Jess Kidd is she writes with real sort of crackle and sparkle. She's witty, but she can also be incredibly poignant. She can move you to tears. This book, Murder at Gull's Nest, is the first in a crime series that she's writing, and it features the amateur sleuth Nora Breen, who has just revoked her nunhood. I don't know what you'd call it, but she's been a nun for 30 years, and she's left her order and gone into the big wide world in search of her friend Frida, who was a novice, who had left the order some time before, I think nearly a year before. She'd been writing really regularly to Nora, and suddenly the letters stop. So Nora is convinced that something's happened to her friend. So she gets herself to Gore-on-Sea, which is this wonderful sort of seaside town in decline. And it's the 1950s, and everybody's sort of, you know, post-war rationing still, the tail end of. And everybody's readjusting, and she stays in this really, really creepy guest house, which has some hilarious characters in it. And yeah, the story unfolds. There are murders, there are twists, and again, I couldn't put it down, and I would highly recommend this as another potential summer read. Nora Breen is a great character. She's really multifaceted, and plausible. Loved it. So the final book I want to talk to you about is Shirley Jackson's The Lottery and Other Stories. Now, over the years, I've read quite a few of Shirley Jackson's stories, The Lottery being one of them, most of which I've read online, I think. So I've never sat and read a whole sort of collection. And actually, I didn't read this in one go. I've read it over a period of time. And I think this is absolutely wonderful. I can just see why there is so much adoration for this writer. She was writing in America from the 40s onwards, and her stories just completely capture the kind of claustrophobia, particularly of being a mother of young children in that era, the very clearly defined gender roles between men and women, the way that everybody is sort of aware of what people think and how important that is. And she manages to, she writes about domestic detail, but she manages to give a sense of menace somehow. Very often, you know, there's this kind of seething menace behind what's happening. There's one story in particular in here that I absolutely loved. I think it's called The Flowers or The Flower Garden. And it really looks at society and the hypocrisy of it. A woman moves into a small town in America with a young child, and you see her arrive through the point of view of another woman who has become her neighbour, and she's also got a young child and a mother who's very, very what's the word, sort of conventional. And she goes round to this woman's house and really admires her. She loves the way that she's decorated the house. This is the newcomer into the town, and she befriends her. And the next thing that she's going round for tea, daily. The children are playing together, and all the time this is meeting with a little bit of concern and disapproval from the actually it's her mother-in-law, not her mother. And they go to the butcher's together and all that kind of thing. And then the woman who's moved into the town employs a gardener who is black, and the whole relationship changes, and it just completely exposes the hypocrisy of attitudes towards race. And sadly, I think, certainly in the area where I live, potentially this sort of story could almost happen now. I mean, it's frightening, really, in some ways. I'll get my words out in a minute. The sense that we may not have moved on as much as we might like to think. So yeah, I found these stories really thought-provoking, and I think if you're interested in in 1950s society particularly, this is a really rich source of information about what it felt like to be an adult in those times. Yeah, loved it, and I will be going back and reading more. So there we are, quite a stack of books. Thoroughly enjoyed my reading over the last few months, and yeah, all of those books I commend to you. And if you've read them and you want to sort of compare notes and let me know what you've been reading over the last few months as well, I'd be delighted to know. Take care, everybody. I'm going to go out and enjoy the sunshine now. Bye.